So, you're interested in building your own PC. I think it's personally a great idea. It teaches you a lot about computer hardware, and also it gives you something that you can work and play games on. It's overall great, and building your own typically will give you better bang for your buck. So for building your own PC, the best place to find the parts you need is PC Part Picker. It gives you all the information you need about prices, all the information you need about performance, and it really makes it easy for beginners to easily pick out the parts they need and buy them so they can begin assembly. The parts you will need for the actual assembly really boil down to three things, of which two I believe are really important, and one is really the only necessary one. You will need a Phillips head number 2 screwdriver to build a PC. It's essential, it's used a lot. An electrostatic wristband is incredibly nice to have. If you are spending a lot of money on a PC, I would highly recommend this. It works by attaching this little clip to a grounded piece of metal, which you should look into. I'm not going to explain the basics of grounded metal during this video. And then you attach this little band around your wrist. It will make it so you do not emit any static shocks to a motherboard or a CPU, which could potentially damage it. And nice to have, but I do not believe most of you will need it, is pliers. If you need to bend something or find yourself in a situation where you may need to improvise on construction of the PC more than normal, pliers are nice to have. So once you've ordered all the components, you really want to start with your motherboard. The first thing you should really do to assemble your PC is get the CPU. You can see it right here. Yours might look a little different, but the instruction for all of them is essentially the same. What you want to do is line up the little triangle that is provided on all CPUs, Intel, AMD, it doesn't matter, and you want to line it up accordingly on the socket. You can see right here there is a little arrow indicator in the bottom left, which tells me how to put it in. So you line up the little gold arrow with that little arrow on the socket, and you just prop it in. You use the lever. This looks a little different on Intel processors, but it's essentially the same process. And there you go. You've installed your CPU, and you can move on from there. So the next step is installing the CPU fan on top of your newly installed CPU. The first thing you want to do, you might be wondering what this strange gray residue is in our CPU. That's thermal paste after it's been squished by a CPU cooler. What you're going to want to do is, if your CPU isn't pre-applied to the bottom of the CPU cooler, which it might be, you want to put a little pea-sized dot of thermal paste on the center of the CPU. It may seem like almost none, but if you put too much on, it will damage the motherboard and potentially wreck your PC. So for cooler orientation, just make sure the cable from the CPU fan is an appropriate distance from the header. The header's here on my board. So what I'm going to do is slap on this fan with the cable facing there. I'm going to cut back to you guys once it's screwed in, but all this is you just line up the holes with the screws built in, and you just screw it in. So once you've screwed the CPU fan in, you'll know you're done when it no longer is able to significant force. What you do is you just take the little cable here and hook it up to your fan header. You just line up the little divots in it with this little bar here. It varies by fan header, but it's generally the same. Just make sure it fits. It's okay if you mess up at first. And just slide it in there, and then you're good to go. So once you're done installing the CPU and the CPU fan, I recommend you do RAM next. RAM's very easy to install, but you can mess up. Make sure to refer to your motherboard's guide, motherboard's manual, to see the proper order to put them in the DIMM slots. But generally speaking, it's either 1, 3, which means you put a slot in 1 and put a slot in 3, or 2-4, which means you put a slot in 2 and you put a slot in 4. Because this PC is being used for nothing but testing, I'm just going to put them in 1 and 3. I have no idea if that's correct or not, but it's just for the sake of demonstrating to you guys. So what you do is you make sure the little latches are down. If there's no latches, you just immediately press. Simple as that. And you just make sure it lines up with these dim sockets here, dim sockets, and you press it in. Most of you will probably be using at least 2 sticks. So you get your second stick and just do the same thing. Make sure they're in the right slots. Latch them all up, and you're good to go on RAM. So once your motherboard's all assembled with the RAM, the CPU, and the CPU cooler, what you then want to do is install the I/O plate if your case requires it. The I/O plate or I/O shield is this little thing right here. Your motherboard manual will walk you through it. And if necessary, install standoffs in your case. This case comes with them pre-installed, but once again, refer to your case manual and it will tell you whether or not you need to install them. And then all it is lining up your motherboard into the case, popping screws in these little holes. They're color-coded almost always. Popping them in, screwing them into the standoffs and or pre-installed standoffs, and then there you go. So once everything in your case is installed, in terms of the motherboard, it's screwed in and all that, what you then want to do is install your GPU, if you have one. If you do not have a GPU because it's integrated into your CPU, then feel free to skip this step. But if you do, all you have to do is just make sure the outside where you will line this up is clear, so there's no obstructions. You line up your GPU, hopefully with a PCIe lane, which are typically black. I don't imagine any of you are going to be using PCI lane GPUs in 2020. You line it up there, and you just basically pop it in. On some motherboards, it's important to note that there may be a latch you have to press first or after. This motherboard's just pressed right in. And once again, refer to your motherboard manual and occasionally use common sense. If there's a latch, you may have to press it. So this is another step that may or may not apply to you, so feel free to skip if it does not apply to you. So some cases come pre-installed with case fans, some do not. So you may have to install case fans, especially if you want better thermal performance. So what you do for installing case fans is first think where you want to put the fans. Typically you can put them near the front of the case, and typically you can put them near the back of the case. For this instance, I want to put one fan in the back, and I want it to be an exhaust. Exhaust means that it's pushing air from the hot components out. Intake means it's taking air from the outside in. They both have their positives and negatives. I recommend you do research to see which is going to do the best for your case. Typically the YouTube channel Gamers Nexus does a lot of very good in-depth fan reviews. If you really want to push the limits in terms of your case's thermal performance. So an important thing to note is that you can actually tell from your fan itself which way the air is going to go. Typically speaking, if the fan is facing the sticker is the direction that the air is going to. It's taking in from the non-sticker side and it's pushing out the sticker side. An easy way to tell this is that the blades here are convex and the blades here are concave. So to make this an exhaust fan, I will mount it so that the air is coming out this way because the sticker's here, it's going here. So I rotate it here. You line it up with one of the spots on your case for exhaust, and then you'll just screw it in and attach it to the motherboard. So I just wanted to elaborate a bit more on the case fan. Once you have it screwed in to your case and set up all properly, you're going to take the cable and you are going to find a header on your motherboard that says sys fan. They vary greatly in location, but if it says sys fan and then a number, you plug it in there. In my case, on this motherboard, it is right here, if you can see it. This little thing right there. You just line up the little divots with the header right there. Plug it in, and there you go. So, this is a power supply. The power supply is typically screwed into your chassis around here. Sometimes it's near the bottom if you have a PSU shroud. Just look to your motherboard manual. An important thing to note is that although this one is fanless, if you have a fan, be sure to point it towards an exhaust port. An exhaust port will look something like this. It will be almost graded. If you do not face the fan the correct way, you risk severely harming your PSU's lifetime and potentially causing your system major issues down the line. I recommend that you place the PSU in. Keep in mind that this way goes out. The side with the port, I should say, goes out. And you're just going to place it in. Line it up over here with the holes in your chassis. Can sometimes be a tight fit, as I take it you guys are seeing now. Just give me a second. I wouldn't recommend using that much force, but I've done this a few times. So once this is in, I wouldn't recommend screwing it in until you've connected all the cables. We will be doing that off camera. Just refer to your motherboard manual. It'll tell you where to plug everything in. It varies so much by board. There's no point in me going over it specifically. Once that's in though, all you want to do is just take screws and screw your PSU in. So once you're done wiring up the rest of your case, wiring up everything on your motherboard, you are then ready to move on to the next steps. It is fine if you have connectors that are unused, like this SATA connector right here. It's fine. If you have a semi-modular or fully modular power supply, you may have less cables. It's purely for aesthetic reasons. This is a non-modular power supply. We have tons of leftover cables. It's fine. It will still run fine. Don't worry about it. So as I was saying, the next step is then going to be installing your storage. You may have multiple storage drives, all this kind of thing. We are just going to cover installation of a hard drive in this video. Installation of a SSD that is non-M2 is very similar to hard drive installation, minus where you put it in. Just refer to your case manual. Very similar. For M2 installation, that's a bit more in-depth. If any of you are using a M2 or NVMe, as it's called, SSD, typically you are going to screw it into, on motherboards that support M2 SSDs, there will be a slot somewhere towards the CPU where you want to screw it in. Screw it in the highest M2 point available. The lower you screw it in, the worse bandwidth it's going to get. Screw it in as close to the CPU as you can. So now that that's over with, I'll go into installing a hard drive. All it is you get a SATA connector. You line it up with one of these ports right here. Hook it in. Then there is typically another cable. This is also for it. You hook it in right there as well. And then you just hook it right into your motherboard. And then there you go. So I recommend once your PC is finished that you put your storage device not laying freely, you put it in a hard drive cage, which once again, refer to your case manual for that, and preferably wire manage your PC. This is the perfect time to clean up your cables. I do it with cable ties, but don't use any that are too strong, otherwise they will be quite difficult to remove should you ever decide, say, to upgrade your CPU or upgrade your PSU, which will happen. So, once you've done all that, congratulations, you have finished the hard part of building your PC, and you are then ready to test it. One thing that you should remember to do is a lot of PSUs have a switch here. This one doesn't. You need to remember to swap the switch to on before you try and test your PC. So once this is good, you hook up everything you need. You hook up a monitor, you plug it into the wall, you hook up a keyboard, you hook up a mouse, really hook up all your peripherals. And then once that is done, you are going to turn it on. Your computer will do something called a post or a power on self-test, and we will cover that in just a second on my home PC. All right, so you see this screen, and although it may seem like you've done something wrong or you've messed up building your PC somehow, this is actually what you want. If you reach this step, your PC has posted correctly, and that means you can really start to get into actually finishing it. So what you want to do from here is turn your PC off, and then from there, you will be able to access BIOS. Accessing BIOS varies by motherboard. What you typically do is press a button. It will tell you this button in a prompt, which will very, very briefly flash. Typically, it's either F12 or delete, but on some motherboards, I believe it's also F1. Just once again, if you miss the message first time, it's no big deal. Just remember to press the key as your PC is booting up from off, and you will be into BIOS. From here, you can manage a lot of things on your newly built PC, such as the fan curves, the clock speeds of your CPU and RAM, and all that. But a really important thing you want to do first is install your OS. Whether you're a Linux guy or a Windows guy, you want to get an ISO on a USB, and from there, you plug it in. It should appear somewhere in the boot priority. This varies by BIOS, keep this in mind. Mine's MSI Click BIOS 5. This might look very similar or very different, but this process is the same. You move the USB device you have your OS on to the top of boot priority, and then once it's in the top of boot priority, your PC will then boot to that the next time you turn it on. So, once you have installed your OS and done all that, I would recommend you look into installing drivers for your PC, installing any software you need, and doing all that. But past that point, you now have a fully functional PC. Enjoy it. Thanks for tuning in for this hour of code lesson, and for any of you from Computer Hardware Club also checking this out.
Major fracture detected. Electrical damage detected.